So, questions? Yes.
So, thank you all so much for really wonderful papers, and I'm really struck about the extent to which the productivity of land and the theft of land and the use of enslaved people to create wealth is at the core of so many of these stories. And I just wanted to ask Dr. Lehman a question about the way this ownership of land by Southern slaveholders played out. So, are most of them moving to Minnesota, or are they managing their lands in Minnesota in this, as a corporate business or as a business in the same way that they're managing their plantation lands? And can you track the flows of money back and forth?
Well, the overwhelming majority of Southerners who are buying land in Minnesota are not living there. They're just coming there during the spring or summer months, making their purchase, and then going back to the South. And some of the Southerners buying land have people in Minnesota overseeing their property and making sure that nothing happens to it. But the people who are making the investments just see them as investments that will bring added value to their investment portfolio, so to speak. It just so happens that around the time that Minnesota becomes a state, there's been this economic panic, the Panic of 1857. And those two events combined immediately make Minnesota land not as valuable and not as worth the trouble of trying to negotiate the new anti-slavery policy of the state of Minnesota. But the tourist business really tries to hold on to Southern slaveholders as much as possible. And I'd already mentioned the sort of warped rationale that the locals tried to have who were pro-slavery. But it extended all the way to 1860 when there were a couple of people who were in the Minnesota legislature who actually tried to pass a bill that would make slavery legal in Minnesota during the tourism season. And fortunately, that bill failed, but among the people who voted for it were a man out of Sauk Rapids by the name of George Sweet, who was a legislator, and a few other people. Ironically, it was William Sprigg Hall, that judge who was serving in the legislature at the time, who voted against it. So you never know how this plays out. But that's how far it got, that Minnesota actually tried to legalize slavery during part of the year after it already became a free state.
Yes, question, Michael.
I really enjoyed the panel as well, and I thought all the papers were really insightful and original. I just have a question for Balraj in particular, but the rest of you should feel free to chime in. I was just thinking about my first year in graduate school, and I was writing in a paper for Thomas Holt. I was quoting Malcolm X, and I said something like, well, as Malcolm said, land is the basis for all independence, And Thomas Holt wrote back that, well, this is more true when the founders said it than when Malcolm said it, right? I always thought that was interesting because for Thomas Holt, the land question for African Americans in particular maybe wasn't as salient in the present as it once was, but you're sort of encouraging us to think about what seems like sometimes a discussion about racial stratification and what sometimes seems like a discussion of conquest as being two parts of the same discussion. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, if you were to encourage people to think about the conquest of the Americas differently or the U.S. differently, what would you say is happening in like Du Bois' emphasis on race and the other emphasis on land that you sort of want to like think about?
Well, I was trying to figure out what Du Bois meant. Like, I was trying to figure out within the context of, like, how do I receive, I was trying to flip it from an indigenous perspective, like what, especially, like Du Bois is he's very much of, he's a progressive, and he uses this word modern civilization, right? Which is, at that time, modern civilization is being articulated with primitive cultures as the foil, right? So he's very much, I mean, there's that book called Conscripts of Modernity, I think David Scott. So, but I can't get fully on board with that, because he's also is talking about the way, then I realized Du Bois is very much talking about processes of colonization and how, and he's not just talking about the United States, he's talking about a global imperial process in which, for example, like in the Cold War, you don't have United States and Russia fighting each other, right? Like you have wars happening on Asian lands, like, you know, anti-communist wars happening on Asian lands, not between these two, you know, European and white American sort of structures, right? And so he is thinking about like where globally people of color are gonna fit into the system. And so I don't think he can quite, I mean, he left this country, right? He went to Ghana. And so I was trying to figure out how much of this is, like what he said made me want to go to his writings and see how he talked about indigenous peoples of this country, right? And how he was thinking of Black belonging within that framework. And then, so Malcolm understood very well, yeah, as you said, that you need a space where you can be a people, right? And Vine Deloria very much says that. And so sitting here in 2018, it all feels very essentialist. But I'm trying to figure out, well, maybe they're right, you know? And so what does that mean for us living on this colonized land? How will we together move forward?
I have a piggyback question off of that, which is sort of inspired by Gordon's sort of horizontalism in a sense, but I think the question is also more geared towards Nu and Balraj, and it's that you all mentioned the discourse of abundance, right? In a sense, so Balraj, in your example, the abundance of indigenous land in the West became sort of used as a spigot to relieve tensions in terms of anti-Blackness and sort of white settler freedom. Mm-hmm. And so how sort of abundance gets used as a spigot to sort of deal with that scarcity. In news, your sort of notion of abundance became sort of used as a discourse, again, of sort of unburdening of the settler state. Right now, we can approach abundance now that we have sort of absolved ourselves and are newly innocent. So how, it'd be just to sort of, in this sort of comparative thinking through each other horizontally, how does abundance sort of, you know, think through abundance here with me a little bit. Or maybe the sort of back and forth between abundance and scarcity even.
I guess I'll begin. Thank you for the question, first of all. I think that one thing that I'm noticing when I'm looking at the two public apologies, right, is that the Canadian state is trying to situate itself as, of course, this kind of leader in this, movement towards forgiveness and reparations. And one of the things that the 1988 public apology does is to work to inaugurate Japanese Canadians into this liberal multicultural state. And in that way, I feel as if, looking at the apology specifically, that there's this inauguration of Japanese Canadians as a multicultural settler, right, or a racialized settler. And I think that in that invocation of the land of abundance, it's kind of saying, this history of scarcity, in a sense, that Japanese Canadians or racialized Canadians experience can now end, right? And now you can be inaugurated as a settler who will, in a sense, reap the benefits of this narrative of abundance, which again is contingent on settler, the colonial structure that dispossesses indigenous communities. So that's kind of how I read this invocation of abundance there.
Any other questions?
So just work with me for a little bit because I have a couple of thoughts, but there was something from, I forget your names, but I think Dr. Gill's presentation that you said about, it was like memorial for the Dakota 38 is an object but an act, and that somehow makes sense for me in Dr. Lee's presentation where you talk about how reparations is like utilized as an apparatus for the state to like reify structure as a settler colonial state. So then my question is, if the state is always going to use reparations and forgiveness as a way to only like just reify their own, like position as this sort of like settler colonial like, function, then how can indigenous folk like live within the state? Like, I guess like if their legacy like once like colonists set foot on American land and American soil, like has always been like it's been a history of like torture and just like subjugation. How can they exist outside of that if like all avenues for like forgiveness or at least moving past this history of like suffering is always going to be used to like I guess reify the state?
So when the first settlers, like they came here, I mean, have you read Cronin's book on changes in the land? So everything, the way they were seeing abundance, they were seeing so much, and then they were like, we're gonna sell it. We're gonna privatize this, and we're gonna sell it, and we're gonna make some money off of this. And that was the case with everything that was there. It was the case with the land. The land became alienable, saleable. And so the thing is, and that is the sort of mode in which we exist now, right? Everything is more and more privatized, And so you keep having these weird cycles of history where, like, even gentrification, you can think of it as the same in this parallel to processes of colonization, right? And so, I don't know, so long as we have these sort of processes keep going, the very processes that dispossessed indigenous people, I don't see a way out.
I think, again, sort of invoking what, Gordon, you had talked about in terms of sort of horizontal relations is a very kind of important thing to also highlight as well, because I think the settler state perpetuates itself by these asymmetries across differently racialized and colonized communities. And so I think that the dialogue of the ways in which different communities are made to be separated from each other, or their relationships are made to be erased, right? The way, the way that we've talked about, these relationalities are oftentimes made invisible, and I think that putting that to the forefront is a really kind of important, at least for my work, it's really important to put that in the forefront, and also to place into the forefront, again, my presence as a not a Native person on indigenous lands, and to recognize my own responsibilities, right, in relationship to that. But I think that, again, bringing together histories of racialization, imperialism, and settler colonialism is something that I think is one way through which to, continue to, again, keep the settler state accountable for these maneuvers that they continually represent as sort of the way forward, right?
I think that's a thought-provoking space to end. Thank you all so much, panelists.